A prince born of severe inbreeding, physically deformed, incredibly unstable, and coincidentally, the heir to the Spanish throne. Sounds like a dark fairy tale, doesn't it? But this was the harsh reality of Don Carlos, Prince of Asturias. Many might mistakenly think he was the biological son of Queen Mary I, as the title cherished son seems to imply a special bond. But the truth is, Don Carlos was the illegitimate son of Philip II, Mary I's husband, and never actually met his stepmother. His behavior raised alarm bells from childhood, eventually becoming so dangerous that his own father had to take drastic measures, shocking royal courts across Europe. Today, we're going to pull back the terrifying curtain behind the short and tragic life of this prince. What truly shaped such a brutal and unstable personality? Let's find out. Don Carlos was born on July 8, 1545, the son of the future Philip II and Maria Manuela of Portugal. This was widely celebrated as a momentous event, marking the birth of the heir to the mighty Spanish throne. However, behind the facade of power and expectation lay a seldom mentioned truth, a horrific genetic legacy that shaped Carlos's destiny from the moment he was in the womb. Delving into the family tree, we uncover a terrifying degree of inbreeding. Carlos's parents were first-degree double cousins. This means they shared 25% of their DNA, equivalent to a half-sibling relationship. To truly visualize this, if we were to draw a family tree, you'd find that Carlos had only 6 great-grandparents instead of the usual 16. One prominent ancestor, also Carlos's great-grandmother, was Joanna the Mad, Catherine of Aragon's sister. She was also known for severe mental illness, indicating a clear genetic footprint in this lineage. Tragedy continued to plague Carlos from childhood. His mother, Maria Manuela, died just 4 days after giving birth, at age 17, due to a massive hemorrhage. His father, Philip II, though affectionate towards his son, was often absent and distant. Carlos grew up in isolation, lacking the care of both his biological parents, a factor that may have contributed to the development of his later personality. The first abnormal signs appeared very early in Carlos's physical form. He had one leg shorter than the other, affecting his gait. Royal portraits were often diplomatically painted to hide these deformities, making Carlos appear more normal. But genuine descriptions from contemporaries painted a starkly different, heartbreaking picture. The imperial ambassador Adam von Dietrichstein, describing Carlos at age 18, sketched a painful portrait. Brown curly hair, a long jaw, a pale face, one shoulder slightly higher than the other, a sunken chest and a small hump on his back, at waist level. The left leg much longer than the right. Weak legs. His voice was hoarse and sharp, he had trouble speaking and words were difficult to utter. Additionally, Carlos suffered from chronic illnesses like recurrent fevers, jaundice and bouts of malaria. So did these birth defects and prolonged illnesses define his fate from the beginning, or were they merely the start of a more complex chain of tragedies? And can we solely blame genetics, or did other factors also impact this prince's personality? Despite his physical ailments, Carlos was recognized as the legitimate heir and treated as a true prince. He participated in public events and was acknowledged as the successor to the thrones of Castile and Aragon. This is the popular view. Carlos's position was unshakable, a source of hope for the future of the kingdom. However, there were seldom mentioned complications in the political marital relationships surrounding Carlos. His inheritance, seemingly secure, was deeply influenced by the marriage treaty between his father, Philip II, and Mary I of England. The stepmother Carlos never met. According to this treaty, if Philip and Mary had a child, that child would inherit Burgundy and the Netherlands, not Carlos. This reveals how even the heir's position could be trampled by political agreements, a painful truth about the nature of royal power. Furthermore, Carlos's life saw a series of failed marriages. Elizabeth Tudor was once mentioned as a potential candidate, but would a strong-willed queen, not keen on marriage, accept a Catholic Spaniard, 14 years her junior, physically deformed, rumoured to be mentally unstable, and also the nephew of her former husband? The answer seems to be no. even though rejecting an arranged marriage was incredibly difficult for a queen of that era. Mary, Queen of Scots, was another candidate. But the greatest tragedy was with Elizabeth of Valois, his stolen love. Carlos was betrothed to her in 1559, but just 1 year later, his father, Philip, married the 13-year-old girl himself in February 1560, much to Carlos's intense displeasure. This event undoubtedly caused a deep psychological wound for Carlos, further aggravating his existing instability. Another astonishing detail: Philip later married his own niece, Anna of Austria, after Carlos's death, emphasizing that he still hadn't learned the lesson about inbreeding and its risks. How did these disappointments and betrayals in love affect Carlos's mental health, and how did he express that instability in his later years? From an early age, it was clear that Carlos was mentally unstable. This was a common view that many contemporaries observed, but the less talked about details truly show the cruel extent of this behavior, rather than just telling us about it. Even Carlos's grandfather, Emperor Charles V, was deeply disappointed with the 11-year-old boy when they met in 1556. Charles V found Carlos rude, disrespectful towards his Aunt Joanna, and poorly educated. He even suggested confining him at Tordesillas, where Joanna the Mad had lived for half a century. This was an alarming sign from a seasoned monarch, indicating that Carlos's instability far exceeded that of a normal child. Stories of Carlos's cruelty send shivers down one's spine. He committed horrifying acts of violence, such as roasting animals alive or forcing a shoemaker to cut and eat a pair of ill-fitting shoes. These were not mere childish pranks, but rather proof of a malevolent and uncontrollable soul. A Venetian observer remarked, "He did not want to learn or exercise, but only wanted to harm others." Carlos was also known for his gluttony, limited intellectual capacity, arrogance, and complete lack of self-control. His unsuitability for royal office was also very clear. His behavior at public events caused great embarrassment. For instance, on February 22, 1560, when receiving the Cortes' oath of allegiance, Carlos repeatedly refused to let nobles kiss his hand until Philip had to force him. Philip had once considered making his son governor of the Netherlands, but later realized it was a terrible idea because Carlos was completely unfit for any kind of office. These behaviors were not merely stubbornness, but revealed a serious mental decline that was slowly consuming the young prince. And then a horrific accident occurred, making Carlos's mental state even worse. On April 19, 1562, Don Carlos fell down a flight of stairs and suffered a severe head injury. This is a widely known event, marking a turning point in his already tragic life. However, the vivid and frightening details surrounding this accident truly highlight this extreme moment. Carlos was on his way to meet a maid when he tripped and hit his head on a closed door at the bottom of the stairs. He appeared to be unconscious, though some sources say he was initially lucid, then developed a high fever, partial paralysis, and fell into a coma by May 5th. The medical treatments of the time were truly gruesome. Doctors performed procedures like bloodletting, cupping, and even attempted trepanation, drilling into the skull. The horror of the trepanation surgery is recounted in detail. Carlos's doctor opened his scalp, but luckily he realized the skull was not injured and stopped. "I saw the skull white and firm, and from the pores of the bone began to flow small drops of blood, very red, and I stopped drilling. It was clear that the skull was not damaged, nor was there any internal part corresponding to that position." Carlos was fortunate that this procedure was not completed, as it could have killed him. The strangest part was the story of the bizarre remedy and miracle. The dead body of a local saint named Fray Diego, who had died a century earlier but did not appear to be decaying, was brought and placed next to the unconscious prince. Amazingly, Carlos, who was virtually at death's door, suddenly began to recover, regain consciousness, and was walking by mid-June. Many believed this act was a miracle. The historical consequence of this event was that Fray Diego was canonized as Didacus of Alcalá at Philip's request, and the American city of San Diego was named after him. So what truly caused Carlos's injury? Was it a concussion? Could such an injury cause fever, coma, and paralysis? And was the miracle the only reason for his recovery? Or can modern medicine offer another explanation? We are very curious to hear the opinions of medical experts watching this video. Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Most people know that Carlos's recovery was only temporary. His physical and mental health remained as bad as before. But the lesser-known details reveal the dangerous extent of this continuous deterioration. Carlos continued to have high fevers, and despite rumors of impotence, he still engaged in many lewd behaviors towards women, such as suddenly grabbing them on the street and kissing them. But the more serious problems were truly frightening. Carlos abused his father's favorite horse to death after forcing a servant to let him ride it. He also showed an unhealthy devotion to his young stepmother and former fiancée, Elizabeth of Valois. While there's no evidence of an affair, this obsession was clearly a sign of deep psychological instability. Another horrifying story demonstrating Carlos's instability and violence. Walking down the street and being splashed with a little water from a window, he completely overreacted and ordered his guards to burn down the house and kill all its inhabitants. Fortunately, the soldiers returned and explained that there was a dying person receiving the Eucharist inside, and this explanation appeased the erratic and dangerous prince. The escalating tension in his relationship with Philip II became increasingly clear. Carlos increasingly desired to leave Spain to seek power, especially interested in going to the Netherlands, possibly to stir up discontent against his father. The conflict peaked in April 1567, when the Duke of Alba was appointed in Brussels instead of Carlos. Carlos was so enraged that he threatened and may even have attempted to kill the Duke. Sources vary on the details, but one story says he repeatedly attacked Alba with a knife, and the Duke had to defend himself. Carlos openly disrespected Philip, beginning to plot to leave the country without consent, an act that could cause political crisis and war across the Spanish Empire. More frighteningly, he had strongly implied to his confessor that he intended to kill his father. When Philip learned from his half-brother on Christmas Day 1567 that Carlos was planning to flee to Italy, he began to consider drastic actions. These behaviors forced Philip II to make a devastating, unprecedented decision in royal history. What was it, and how did it change Don Carlos's life? Most people know that Philip II took an astonishing step to control his son. But to truly feel the desperation of this king, we need to look at the vivid show, don't tell details of that terrifying night of imprisonment. On the night of January 18, 1568, Philip II, along with 4 state members and guards, sneaked into Carlos's bedroom in the dead of night. What's remarkable is that Philip was wearing armor and a helmet. This detail alone speaks volumes about the level of fear he had for his son, that Carlos might do something life-threatening. They quietly removed all papers and weapons from the room. When Carlos woke up, he was reassured he wouldn't be killed, but was immediately placed under house arrest. Sadly, Carlos pleaded to be killed instead of being imprisoned. Harsh confinement conditions were imposed to ensure safety and control. All heavy objects in the room were removed, presumably to protect Carlos himself as well as his caregivers. Windows were nailed shut. Carlos was then moved to an even more secure room, imprisoned in a tower in the Alcazar for the rest of his life, and virtually held in solitary confinement. Supervision was extremely strict. Only guards, who had to ensure he was never alone, and occasionally a doctor or barber visited. His reading material was limited to religious texts, and he was only allowed to hear Mass through a small hole in the wall. From Philip's perspective, this was an incredibly painful and astonishing decision. He had no other sons at the time, only 2 young daughters. Having to admit that his heir was so unstable, a threat to his father and the kingdom, and could not be trusted to rule, was a huge humiliation for Philip and the entire royal family. Philip admitted to his sister, Queen Maria, that his actions had caused much suffering. Queen Elizabeth of Valois, with whom Carlos had a complex and possibly obsessive relationship, cried for 2 days when she heard the news, showing Carlos's profound impact on those around him. So in a modern context, would there be another way to handle a royal heir with such severe mental problems without resorting to brutal imprisonment? Could Philip's decision be seen as cruel? Or was he merely a desperate man facing an uncontrollable situation? After Don Carlos was imprisoned, Philip tried to control information and cover up his son's worst behaviors. He told the Pope that Carlos was not a heretic or a rebel conspirator, but simply completely lacking the necessary capacity to govern nations. This is a popular view, an attempt to protect royal reputation. However, there are lesser-known details that show Philip's difficult acceptance. To his sister, Queen Maria, he admitted his actions had caused much suffering. He knew from the beginning that his son could not be cured and that this action was permanent. Carlos's final decline in prison did not take long. He became more insane, starving himself, then overeating uncontrollably. Carlos horribly self-destructed, such as swallowing one of his diamond rings, believing the stone would kill him, and covering his bed with snow to harm himself. He quickly fell seriously ill in July 1568 and died on the 24th, at just 23 years old. Carlos's funeral was held with full royal rites, and Philip was said to be deeply distressed, the court mourning for a year. After Carlos's death, wild stories began to emerge, aiming to tarnish Philip's reputation. Fanciful theories suggested Carlos was a secret Protestant and was murdered on his father's orders, possibly by poison or decapitation. This is a prime example of myth-busting and reinterpretation of legacy. However, the harsh truth is that there is no evidence to support these stories. Carlos was a severely ill young man, dangerous to himself and almost every living creature he came into contact with. He died professing the Catholic faith before many witnesses. A motivational analysis shows that if Philip had wanted to kill him, there would have been no need to imprison him first. The act could have been done much more quietly. With Carlos's death, Philip had no male heir. His wife, Elizabeth of Valois, also died that same year. Philip then went on to marry his niece, Anna of Austria, clearly still not having learned the lesson about the dangers of inbreeding. Was Carlos truly the victim of a conspiracy, or was his death simply the tragic outcome of a life filled with illness and instability? Has history been fair to Philip II by labeling him a cruel father? Or was he just a desperate man in an uncontrollable situation?